Why don't you turn your Bibles this morning to John chapter 9. John chapter 9. We're going to cover this chapter over the next 2 weeks, so bear with me. Don't leave today thinking he didn't address this or that. Probably going to look a little more at the practical events of John chapter 9 and more the salvation story of John chapter 9 next Sunday. Every once in a while, whenever we go through a book and I read the passage and think this is a little more of a heart-to-heart. That's where I find myself more this morning with this passage. When I first became a pastor up in Blind River, a gentleman came up to me and he said, "I like your preaching, but you yell too much." I think I actually yell a lot more now than I did back then. But I think there is value sometimes in just calmly sitting down and looking at a passage like this one. And especially it's a passage, I think, that just needs contemplating from us this morning. So I promise not to yell this morning to you, but one of the things that we would ask as humans, I think all of us, there's no exceptions I'm sure here this morning, is the question of why. Lord, why this? Why that? I think both the Christian and non-Christian ask that question a lot. In our passage, the question comes up as why. John 9, verse 1. As he, Jesus, passed by, he saw a blind man from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" Why was this son born blind? We might ask many similar questions. Why was I born into this family? Why did this happen to my child? Why did my child die? Why did my sibling die? Why did my good friend die? Why did my spouse betray me? Why does my spouse act the way that they act? Why did I not get the promotion? Why do I look the way that I look? Why am I not gifted like someone else? Why did this person do this to me when I was a child? Why did their children grow up and succeed and mine seem to struggle so much? These might have been some of the questions of Johnny Erickson, right? Who was paralyzed from the shoulders down after diving into shallow water at age 17. I think it was Chesapeake Lake or Bay. And during her first 2 years of rehabilitation, she admitted that she experienced anger, depression. She questioned her faith. She even considered suicide. Why did I end up in a wheelchair when someone else that doesn't even serve Christ goes on to live a healthy, active life? Why did I choose to go swimming that day? You know that question would come up. Why did I dive into such shallow water? This man who was born blind from birth would live thinking, why? I don't even want to go through this. Why was I born blind? And just think of the time that you've asked that question. Something that happened this morning to you, maybe last week, a year ago, it could be 50 years ago. And you still brood over the question, Lord, why did this happen? Now, some of the whys might be self-inflicted, right? A terrible sin that you committed. A terrible decision that you made. Some of them were maybe done by someone else. It was the drunk driver that you're asking why, or the person that betrayed you. And some of them were out of the control of anyone, like this man who was born blind. The whys, or we might say the reason for something, the cause of something that has happened. And as that reason is considered, or that cause for something, which is usually we're thinking now in a negative sense, our minds bring regret or anger or hatred. If it was something we did wrong, we'd probably have regret. If it was something that was caused by someone else, we might think of anger or hatred towards them. And if it was completely out of the control of any human being, we might be angry at God this morning. So Jesus has asked the question in our story, Lord, what was the cause of this man being born blind? Someone might ask a similar question today, why is this child struggling so much? Well, her mom was an alcoholic. Her mom was addicted to drugs. Or his father abandoned the family, or his father abused him. Well, Jesus does not answer the question by blaming the parents or the man himself, but states in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this was so that the works of God might be manifested in him. Jesus goes deeper than the why. He goes deeper than the immediate cause of something, if there was one. And he really explains what we might call the purpose of the circumstance. Not necessarily the immediate reason, but the purpose that it happened. Listen to the definition of purpose. The reason for which something exists, the reason it exists, or is done, or is intended, or desired. The result, the end, the aim, or the goal. See, purpose brings an overarching definition to life, doesn't it? The whys of life. That yes, there may or may not have been immediate cause for something in a certain situation, but there is also an overarching purpose for the event or that circumstance. In fact, purpose actually indicates that there actually is an intent of why this happened. In other words, it's not just happen chance. In fact, purpose, the whys of the circumstance try to draw whatever information it can from the incident. You and I can lie in bed at night and drive ourselves crazy as why this person did this, or why this person did that. I'm sure the parents of Johnny Erickson, do I keep cutting out here? Am I all right? You can hear me okay? Okay. I'm sure the parents of Johnny Erickson may spend sleepless nights wondering why they let their daughter go swimming that day. But purpose, listen to this carefully. We need to know this, brothers and sisters. Purpose, though often unknown, is the explanation of everything. Everything. Nothing happens in our world, nothing happens in our universe that God does not have an explanation for, or that God has a purpose for. I want you to think right now of something in your life that you're asking the question, why? And this might cause you to stay awake or become angry or bitter or hateful. And we cannot, of course, here neglect our own sin. This is not us about thinking, well, it was not my fault when it was your fault. But this is about looking at the situation now after admitting your own wrongdoing in the circumstance, or your own lack of judgment in the circumstance, if this is true in that situation. But now saying, Lord, what are you doing now in this situation? How will you bring glory out of this? John Piper said, no matter what mess you have gotten yourself into, I like that terminology, no matter what pain you are in right now for a number of human causes, that is not the main point of this story. You could drive yourself crazy on that issue and it will get you nowhere. His fault, her fault, my fault. Only what God is going to do now. Where is he taking us? Where is he taking me? That is the answer that you need. Because if you think, no, I don't want to go through all this. I don't want to be blind for the rest of my life. I don't want to sit in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. Lord, I cannot accept this. You need to understand that that kind of thinking will do you no good. Now, in this case, there's no guilt of the mom and dad or the son, and it doesn't mean that they did not sin. It just means it was not the cause of this man being born blind. Now, we know the story. Jesus is going to restore this man's sight. There's some interesting, almost humorous facts about this story that we're going to look at next week. But this man will gain his sight. But that's not the reality in most situations. Because for most situations, the man will remain blind the rest of his life, and Johnny Erickson has remained in a wheelchair the rest of her life. So the challenge here for you and I is that to be able to place a greater value on what Jesus draws attention to in this story, the work of God. In other words, we are to look more to the glory of God than on the circumstances of life. More to God's glory than the situation that we actually find ourselves in this morning. And that's not normal for us. Our minds don't normally work that way. But that really becomes the question, doesn't it? Is the glory of God, the treasure of God, the person of God, is he more valuable to me than life itself and the circumstances of life? Listen to the words of the psalmist in Psalm 63, verse 3. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips will laud you or praise you. The value placed upon God and the value placed upon his character is even better than life itself. See, so much of evangelicalism has taught us that serving God means blessings and fulfillment. So it's actually pitted that against God's purposes. If I do this, the blessing ratio automatically goes up. I think that sometimes. Things start to go bad, I start to think, is God cursing me today for some reason? The problem with this, it's most often not true. The other problem is we're looking, I think, for the wrong blessings. For the blessings we're looking for are often directly related to life. Yet the psalmist says your loving kindness is better than life. The blessings of God's loving kindness, not a physical or necessarily earthly blessing, is better than life itself. Listen to Jesus' view of this life versus God's purposes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better you enter life crippled or lame than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than having 2 eyes to be cast into fiery hell. It would be impossible for a person to hold to such truth. It would be better to have 1 hand or 1 eye if he did not hold to such a high view of the glory of God. This is where Johnny Erickson found herself a few years later, realizing the value of God's glory being shown through her accident and her later intimate relationship with Christ to be more valuable to her than walking and running and doing what almost every other human being does every day. Listen to the Apostle John. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will bless you greatly in this life. I will give you a bigger house. I'll restore all your relationships. You'll have an awesome marriage, and I will solve your problems. No. I will bless you in eternity. I will give you the crown of life. If you're taking notes this morning, principle number 1. Above all other things, a believer must treasure most the glory of God. Above all other things, a believer must treasure most the glory of God. I want Christ more than anything else. I want Christ more than even family. I want Christ more than being a mom or a dad. And I love being a dad. I want Christ more than a better job or a bigger house. I used to think I just want the Chicago Blackhawks to win the Stanley Cup before the Lord would return. Fortunately, I've matured a little since then. Now I just want them to be better than Toronto, that's all. I want to get married before the Lord takes me, right? You ever thought that? No, the hope of the Christian is I want Christ more than anything else. And I want his purposes for my life. And that could be really hard. Think of it this way. You have a treasure chest on one side. Valuable. It's gold and money, houses and cars and cottages, health, great marriage, great kids, well-paying job, a full box of unfrosted blueberry Pop-Tarts for my holidays coming up, which I already have all to myself, right? On the other side, you have this treasure chest of Christ. Everlasting worship and praise of God. And Christ being glorified in your body now and forever. Which box do you choose? Where is your heart? See, this is Christianity 101, isn't it? But this is really hard. Jesus is so clear on this. Do not store for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven that neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And I want to say at this point, I know we are not a perfect church. I know that. I'm not a perfect pastor. But it is a blessing to be at a church to know your heart. And I know the majority of you, this is where your heart is. It's hard. But I know this is truly what you want. The challenge of living on this earth, being surrounded by so much, yet at the same time to cherish more the heavenly things. I was talking to my sister yesterday, and she was reading an article by A.W. Pink in 1940, wrote, with the affluent society we live in, it is so hard to be a Christian today. Probably people who lived in the 40s, the average Canadian would be considered poverty line today. So how are you doing with this? Maybe ask your kids, what is your mom and dad most passionate about? How would they answer that question? It's easy to tell our kids what they need to be passionate about, but another thing to ask them, what do you see in my life? You know, I continue to be impacted with the shortness of time, and we always have grandkids come to our house during the summer, and they stay for about 4 days, and we have them come in 3 groups, the older group, the middle group, and the younger group. And this past week we had the older group. And as these kids get older, they stay up later. They sleep in longer. And we get playing games with them at night. And many of the nights were close to midnight by the time we got done, and close to 1 o'clock by the time they settled down and stopped giggling. Tuesday night we had an elders meeting here. I got home about 10 o'clock, and I get home and they're ready to play games. And On the outside, I'm excited. On the inside, I'm completely exhausted. But of course, I don't want to lose either, so that gives incentive to me too. But we had a ball. I was dragging by the end of the week. And some of those kids are now teens. And you realize so much the urgency of time. The gift of time that God has given to us, though short, so important that you and I do not waste any time that God has given us. So here too in this passage I see, if you're taking notes this morning, the first thing there in your notes, there's urgency. Verse 4, urgency. We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. There's an urgency if I'm going to treasure most the things of God. Now, if I'm going to treasure the earthly, there's a lot of time. We really have 70, 80 years to treasure earthly things. But if heavenly things, there's so much more to do and time is short. And therefore the need to be urgent about our time. Be careful how we spend our time. Our decisions, our choices will really prove to us whether we truly believe this or not. Verse 6 in our passage, when Jesus had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the saliva and rubbed the clay in his eyes. And we'll look at that. That's a humorous passage there next Sunday. And said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. The second thing I notice in this is just simple obedience. Obedience. Jesus simply asks the man to do something and he does it. It's like having great kids. You just simply say, do this, and they do it, right? That is what God requires of us. He would simply ask us to do something, and we would do it. Mom and Dad, our greatest example to our children is not our direction or teaching to them, though that I'm not going to underestimate that because that is hugely important. But I believe our greatest influence to our children is our own obedience to Christ, by far. Verse 8, therefore the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the one. The third thing I notice in this man is steadfastness. Steadfastness. The world's interest in the world has a persistent interest in Christianity. The world has a desire to eradicate Christianity and God. I heard a quote from the culture the other day. It said, we thought we could abolish God and still retain a value for human beings, and we are finding out that we cannot. The man also says in verse 27, I told you already, but you would not listen. Such a need for steadfastness in our faith, our focus on the glory of God. Because every move we seem to make now as believers will gain us opposition. And we must be ready for that. When we determine to live for the glory of God, our own human nature was going to fight against that. I'm going to fight against that. Society will fight against that. But even the semi-religious will fight against that. Verse 10, so they were saying to him, how then were your eyes open? We might not get that same question, but they will come with the same intent. How do you know you are truly saved? How do you know that your religion is the only religion? Verse 11, he answered, the man who is called Jesus made clay. He rubbed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And so I went away and washed. I received sight. And they said to him, where is he? In other words, prove to me that there is a God. What makes you so certain? See, when we're in church, these answers are so easy for us, aren't they? But when we're on the battlefield, it becomes much more difficult. I like the man's response in verse 12. He said, I don't know. It's good to know that we will not always have the answers. Verse 16, so then some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a sinful man do such signs? And there was a division among them. Hey, what about all the division in Christianity? Why is there so many denominations anyway? How come this church says this about the Bible and this church says this about the Bible? My church is okay with evolution. My church is all right with abortion. My church is okay with homosexual relationships. What makes your church so special? And then, of course, in the story, they go after the parents and they call into question the miracle itself. Verse 20, so his parents answered and said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. So what begins in this story in verses 1 to 7 as this miraculous event that should be praiseworthy and honored to the glory of God is turning into this complete controversy because of unbelief and because of fear. Which brings us to principle number 2. There will be many in the world who will reject Christ. There will be many in the world who will reject Christ. In this story, it's the Jews. And many who will be unwilling to acknowledge Christ. And many who will be unwilling to acknowledge Christ. In this story, it's the mom and dad. Young person this morning, adult, if you have the courage to take your faith to the world, you need to prepare for a lot of pushback. Be prepared to look foolish, not to God, but in the eyes of the world. And even be prepared by those who may be the ones you thought were loyal to you, in this case the mom and dad, to be the ones that might bail on you. Here their son has been miraculously healed. You would think they'd be jumping up and down for joy. And there's such a coolness in their reaction because of fear. You get saved at a conference, right? Where the Lord moves tremendously in your heart through reading his word or a message. You get excited about serving Christ and you determine nothing is going to stop me from serving Christ. And you make this awesome stand for Christ at school, and a Christian friend bails on you. You have a situation where you know the Lord is prodding your heart, and you pray, and you ask the Lord to give you courage, and you finally get the courage to take this huge stand for Christ at the workplace, and you lose recognition from most. And you lose the opportunity to be promoted. Your boss likes you. He appreciates so much your work ethic, but you're a little different. And you don't fit into the politically correct crowd anymore. And your boss needs to be very careful about that. And even those you thought were loyal to you might distance yourself from you when you get too excited about serving Christ. And in this story, it was fear that caused the parents to buckle. Verse 24, therefore a second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He then answered, whether he is a sinner I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, I now see. We're going to look closer at verse 25 next time, but as we compare this whole chapter in relation to verses 35 to 41, but for now, I want to focus on the fact that this whole situation was brought about so that the glory of God would be on display and the work here of Christ would be magnified. And yet the thinkers of the day believe differently, and they say that Jesus is a sinner and that Jesus is all wrong about his teaching. Because our world believes that today. That either Jesus is all wrong, or they may allow Jesus to tag along, but they will change what he said. See, the world believes that their condition in life is going to be completely changed if they're healthier. If they had a little more of the sparkly things that they're looking at, they're going to be happier. If their marriage improved, if their purposes were fulfilled, if only they had a better friendship. And they believe the conditions of our world would improve if global warming is brought under control, because then there'll be less major storms and less earthquakes. If the world was able to speak in just one voice, that would be better. If mankind could just come to agree with one morality, right? That man wrote up. If serious health issues were curable, our world would be much better. Every one of those things eliminates God. Their purpose for life is man and the glory of man. The purpose of this story is the glory of God. Understand that thinking of man without God is going to be completely, and I tried to think of a word here, and the word is useless. Useless. Here we have a story worthy of excitement and triumph. And the world, for some reason, sees a problem with this story. John 12:40, God has blinded their eyes, He's hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and return, and I heal them. This explains why when a person would persevere in a hard marriage, because they believe this is what God would want. And the secular marriage counselor in the world says, no, 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 no. This is why when a young girl believes herself to be a boy, and a loving Christian comes alongside of that young lady and said, listen, God loves you dearly, and He made you the way that you are. The world cries, no, no. When a woman believes that the baby within her has been made by God, and though this is so difficult for her, and sometimes she is all alone, and she does what is right and has the child, the world says, no, no. When a husband leads his family, he leads his spouse, he loves her dearly, and she says, I need to follow his leadership, and she greatly respects her husband, the world says, no, you've got it all wrong, no. And when a church family is led by elders that are men, right? Men. And the church family loves each other. And they learn to be honest and kind, and they work hard, and they're generous, and they believe what God has said. The world says, no, that's wrong. Because their eyes cannot see the glory of God. In closing, I wish to ask two questions that we need to contemplate, because Sundays are a day of holy contemplation. Question number one, is the glory of God the most treasured thing to you? Is the glory of God the most treasured thing to you? To your marriage, your family, your actions at work, your church life. Is everything in your life connected with Christ? Is your marriage connected with Christ? Your work, your playtime, your ministry? Is it all connected with Christ? When I sit down with my family, is Christ oozing from me? When I speak to my spouse, is it Christ-like? When I walk into work or I walk into that ministry, am I Mr. Grouchy? Or do I come with the joy of the Lord? Second question, how do the reactions of the world determine your testimony? It didn't seem to faze this man. We're going to look at that more next week. But does friction or rejection, does that faze your testimony? Does it eliminate your testimony? Does it make you fearful? You want to give up? Or does it make you more determined Or does it deepen your prayer life for those people? You might be going through a heartache right now with a child or some question of why. You might be concerned about your spouse. Where is her heart? Is he or she growing spiritually? Does he or she even love me? You've been praying about something and God just seems to be silent. How does your faith perform amid that kind of discouragement? Treasuring the glory of God. Lord, for what we know not, would you teach us this morning? For what we have not spiritually, would you give us? And for what we are not yet, would you make us? And all God's people said, amen.